Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Church World Service webinar series, Caring in Crisis, the Leader Briefs. I'm Reverend Mary Hughes with Crisis Care Ministries, and we are so glad that you've joined us today. This is our 5th week of a 6-week series, and we've been having an inspiring and wonderful time together as we've been hearing from specialists in family and congregational life, theology, mental health, crisis response and recovery. We've been hearing words of inspiration and words of hope, and today will be no different. I'm so excited in just a moment to introduce you to our speaker today, the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson. But first, of course, a few housekeeping reminders. As the introductory slide rotation indicates, you can find all things webinar, details about our schedule and presenters, resources our presenters have provided, all of that. One-stop shop, crisiscareministries.net. Just click on the webinar hub at the top of the page. It's updated regularly, so you may need to refresh your page. Throughout the webinar today, please feel free to type questions or comments in the question box. That's the question box, not the chat box. And we hope to be able to address those questions and comments toward the end of our hour. After the webinar, watch your inboxes for links to the webinar recordings and a link to the session evaluations. And if you've requested a certificate of attendance, you will receive a link for that by email as well. And if you have questions, contact Heather Wilson. She'll put her email address in the question box. And now it is my great honor today to introduce to you today's presenter, the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson is Associate General Minister, Wider Church Ministries and Operations Co-Executive for Global Ministries at the United Church of Christ. She's an inspiring preacher and theologian who shares her skills and gifts in a variety of settings nationally and internationally, often using her poetry as a part of her ministry. She's a gifted writer and poet. Her book of poetry, Drums in Our Veins, was published in 2020, and it's a compilation of poems that focus on the injustices facing people of African descent and the fight and desire for racial justice globally. Born in Kingston, Jamaica, her poetry and writings reflect her Jamaican heritage and culture, as well as the traditions and lore of her ancestors. Karen Georgia earned her BA from Brooklyn College in New York, a Master of Public Administration from North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina, and a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in New York. She also studied public policy at Duke University and has earned her doctorate in ministry at Seattle University. I know you join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson.
It is a pleasure to be with you and to share this time as we talk about increasing our racial IQ. Thank you, Mary, for the introduction on today. And as we come into this time, the reflection is that we are living in a very diverse world, one which continues to be impacted by crises of various kinds. As faith and community leaders, we are invited to participate in providing response to many who are vulnerable during their time of most critical need. In our conversation today, as we talk about this racial IQ and how to increase that, I'm gonna put before us a set of assumptions. One is that the experience of an individual around race or racism has two sides to it. It's the experience that I might have as an individual, and then it becomes the experience of an action done by another person. So as we talk about increasing your racial IQ, it's about those actions that are perpetuated against another. Quite often in our framing around and conversations about racism, racial justice, that usually predicates on those who have experienced actions of racism or racial injustice to tell the stories. And in this moment, I am inviting those of us who perhaps are on the other side sometimes to begin to think about how our actions perpetuate and to begin to think about how do we increase our racial intelligence quotient, if you will, in a way that allows us to affirm the dignity, the rights, and to respect others in the way that they need to be respected. Our points of diversity are many and they are varied. A blog post that I read recently examined workplace diversity and offered 4 types of diversity. Now, we could dispute this. However, for our purposes today, we will use these categories for the moment. They identify four areas of diversity: internal, external, organizational, and worldview. They identify internal diversity as characteristics which are related to the situations that a person is born into. So, race, ethnicity, age, national origin, sexual orientation, cultural identity, assigned sex, gender identity, physical ability, mental ability. These are points of diversity that quite typically are harder to change and are things that a person did not choose for themselves. They also talk about external diversity, which are personal interests, education, appearance, citizenship, religious beliefs, location, familial status, relationship status, socioeconomic status, and life experiences. It may seem bizarre that I would start here in a conversation about increasing our racial IQ, but what I do want to note is that when we talk about what they note as internal diversity, and race is listed here, increasing our racial IQ means that we're also examining the intersections of race with these internal diversities, but also with external diversity. Because quite often race is accompanied by socioeconomic status or religious beliefs or appearance, meaning the way that people present themselves, the way that people are dressed. So in examining or in looking at how we come at these things, it is important that we understand the intersections and interweavings of these issues and how our own perceptions begin to inform the experiences that others have of us. So these are complex with a myriad of intersections, some of which are identified here. To increase our racial intelligence means that we are moving with intention and self-awareness in the world, and requires that we are in tune with ourselves in connection with the communities we enter and leave. We are expected to bring our whole selves into engagement with this diversity, carrying with us our skills and our expertise, as well as our experiences and expectations of others. Whether or not we're willing to admit it, we also bring with us our fears, the stories we've heard, our prejudice, and our hurts into the professional environment, because this is a part of our whole selves. In the midst of crisis and provision of care, we are expected as faith leaders and as people who are engaged in crisis management, we are expected to bring with us the self-awareness and intercultural competences, which will afford us the opportunity to be present, fully present, to all who are in need. In the provision of crisis care, there is no room for us to discriminate and cause further injury to those we are assisting to receive humanitarian aid and relief, or to provide for what they need in a moment of crisis. We are responding to communities. We are responding to crisis. We are responding to needs for safety. We are responding to ensure that each individual in need of assistance encounters us positively and is left with their dignity and human rights restored and intact. Today's topic, increasing your racial IQ. We are invited to do no harm, an assumption. As people of faith, the sacred texts we use weave a common thread, prioritizing love as an active response to those we identify as neighbors. So, how can we increase our racial IQ to ensure our responses to those in need are appropriate, void of patterns of harm, and promote values of justice? What can we do when we see individuals in crisis being treated differently because of their race or other minoritized diversity? How can we heighten our awareness to ensure we are observant to the mistreatment of others? And what are the values that you bring, or that any of us bring, that are foundational to the work that we do in crisis care? And I just want to go back to number 2 because I talk about minoritized diversity. And when I note that race is a minoritized diversity in many places, right? That there's a power dynamic that causes the oppression that we see, which then becomes racism. So in order for us to talk about increasing our racial IQ, it means that we also have to understand the minoritized context of the diversities that people carry and what that then means, because we're all diverse, but some diversities have more power over dynamics than others, and some are more minoritized than others, further complicating what we see. I want to talk a little bit about, I want to provide 2 examples in this moment for our conversation, and I want to leave these questions up here. This past month, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine escalated, the global community watched as Ukrainians fled for safety. I watched the news and social media and noted the open borders of neighboring countries. Those fleeing from Ukraine were crossing into Poland, Romania, Moldova, Hungary. Some were even going into Slovakia and Belarus. But these were open borders. I was amazed. I had never seen anything like this before. Open borders, free passage. This was unprecedented. I realized rather early in the response to what was happening in Ukraine that European countries were taking care of their own, meaning they were opening their borders to other Europeans, opening and providing shelter to white Europeans. A few days later, the reports started to emerge that these open borders were not extended to all refugees leaving Ukraine. Reports at the beginning of March started to emerge, and our social media feeds began to tell a different story. Africans, Middle Easterners, Indians, Caribbean nationals were among those with documented experiences of being denied access to leave Ukraine. Some of the headlines: Africans say Ukrainian authorities hindered them from fleeing. Another, foreign students fleeing Ukraine say they face segregation and racism at the border. Unequal treatment for foreigners attempting to flee patterns, of blocking, delaying non-Ukrainians. We have seen these stories over and over again. The outpouring of generosity has been remarkable, and it is being witnessed against the stark discrimination and racism that would deny some safety over others. Intentionally leaving others in harm's way while providing preferential treatment to others shows a blatant disregard for human life and is a violation of human rights. In its statement issued on February 28, 2022, the African Union quoted international law noting all people, that's all people, have the right to cross international borders during conflict. This is one example pulled from our news today pertaining to the treatment of those in need of assistance. Some might say, well, there are laws and these are countries, but these are also people. This is one example. I want to give you another example from my past. Years ago, I was working in the state of Florida as part of the response and rebuild following the 2004 and 2005 hurricane seasons. The long-term recovery table was diverse in many ways. Those of us who were doing the work were multi-faith, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-gendered, and reflected a broad spectrum of diversities well beyond the area in which we all lived. In our commitments to rebuild the communities we served, we leveraged the limited resources we each had, along with the use of volunteers to restore communities and lives to where they were prior to the devastation of the hurricanes. Among us was a group of Muslim roofers, professional roofers, I might add, who were a part of the table. They would fix the roofs in the community for cases that were brought to the table, and as others at the table, representing denominations and a variety of organizations, we would pay for the materials. They donated their time and expertise because that was the resource they had. All was going well with partners pooling resources to pay for the materials as needed. And then the day came when one of the partners at the table said he would not allow a roof of someone that was being processed to be fixed because the group of roofers were not Christians. This may be another type of experience, but quite often, as I mentioned before, there are intersections to the experiences and racial dynamics that are experienced by others. So what does that mean for us and for our work together? I want to offer a couple of things in front of us today. I believe if we're going to do this work and we're going to increase our ability to be more aware and to increase our ability to be impactful on behalf of the whole of the communities in which we serve, one, we need to know ourselves. Two, we need to be willing to do our work. Three, we need to increase our intercultural competencies. Four, we need to be aware of the intersectionalities and what those mean for us in the moment. And five, we need anti-oppression models for our work. So let's talk about knowing ourselves. We all have truths. We come from someplace, our lives are impacted by experiences, some of which we probably don't even remember anymore. I remember when I went to seminary, and in the first few weeks leading in, one of the things that we talked about and that was impressed upon us as young seminarians was this idea of self-reflection. We were encouraged to spend the time to know ourselves, to reflect on actions that we had taken, to reflect on our pasts, to know our truths, and to confront them. What that means is the experiences of others, my encounter with someone else, your encounter with someone else leaves an impression. And when we are not in a place where we are confrontational with the truths that we carry, we then carry those in a way that allow us to have these subconscious experiences of our lives that impact others negatively. Now, we are none of us perfect. But what that means is I should be able to know that an experience that I had with someone else impacted them negatively. Or I should be able to listen and to hear someone tell me that something that I did left a negative impression. Self-reflection allows us to be in tune with our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. So our actions mean something, and our ability to bring about change in the world means that we need to begin with change in ourselves. Our interactions with others, particularly around race, is framed in the context of this country. I'm talking about the United States. There may be others who are listening from other places, but I want to use here because this is where I live. The United States has a particular framing of racism and racist narratives. They impact all of us, and our ability to be able to do the self-reflection and to filter through the messages that we're getting means that we are better able to be responsive in our professional lives to the people that we encounter. So, what are your beliefs and what informs the decision or action you are taking in any given moment? So, in an encounter with someone else, how are you experiencing that moment? Is that uncomfortable for you? If it's uncomfortable, why is that uncomfortable? If that interaction is with someone who has a visible diversity from you, where is that message coming from? I want to say if we are not willing to spend the time to know ourselves, then we are not able to do this work, which is to say that we are racially in tune in a way that begins to shift the lenses of oppression that are experienced in the work that we're doing and in the interactions that we are having with others. So knowing yourself and knowing your truths is important. The second thing that I want to just highlight here is do your work. You are the only person who knows yourself. Educate yourself. It's important. That means expose yourself to the experiences of others as best you can. Now, that may sound a little simplistic, but the point here is none of us come with a full knowledge of what someone else experiences. My predominant narrative, I'm a Black woman who presents most often as a Christian because, well, I'm an ordained minister. So when I show up and I say I'm Reverend Karen Georgia Thompson, people hear ordained Black female minister. That is the grounding of my experience. But I work in a predominantly white environment, and I've gone to predominantly white schools, which means that I have had to avail myself of what it means to move and to work and to live in predominantly white environments. That's an education. It requires a cultural shift because that is not normative for me. It means that also, as a Black woman who has had experiences of racism and racist experiences, I bring that with me. So, how I navigate the world is informed by those experiences. But what I've learned is clearly that every experience with someone who doesn't look like me, every experience is not about a moment of oppression. However, there are moments of oppression, and when they do happen, I need to find my way to being able to speak to that moment in a way that is going to inform the other person if they are willing to hear it. For someone who's on the other side of conversation with me, educating um, educating themselves would mean understanding or learning something about what it means to live in Black community, where Black people are coming from. There is a complexity to African descendant peoples. We are a range of 200 people living in the Americas. I was born in Jamaica. Quite often I'm mistaken as African American, and that's okay, but I am a Jamaican born and raised. So how then do we come at understanding people, allowing them to self-identify? That is about us doing our own work. We all have a shadow side, meaning things that make us uncomfortable, experiences that we've had. How we investigate and interrogate that shadow side is a part of doing our work and saying, what are the things that have caused us trauma? What are the things that are problematic for us? And being willing then to take the steps that are necessary to undo the damages perhaps that we've experienced in our own lives, so that when we encounter others, we are in a place where our self-awareness is high enough that we can engage others from a full, authentic experience of ourselves. Where did the beliefs that you have come from? We carry beliefs about other people, other countries, other spaces. And when we talk about racism, this is specifically about race. In the United States, quite often, this is a Black and white dynamic. It's about a white majority and the minoritized experiences of Blacks, Indigenous people, Latinx individuals, and a host of other communities that we can identify. And quite often, this too is mixed again with other intersections. So what it means when we encounter someone from a different race who also has a different religious experience. Learning, educating yourself, doing the work that you need coming out of your self-reflection becomes important. Intercultural competencies. Intercultural competence is the ability to develop targeted knowledge, skills, and attitudes that lead to visible behavior and communication that are both effective and appropriate in intercultural interactions. I frame intercultural competencies here because quite often, even though we're talking about race as a particular dynamic, this is framed within a context of intercultural interactions that are also journeying with the racial dynamics that we carry. I'm not going to go further into this, but to say that intercultural competencies do not come overnight. So going back to that piece about doing our work, it is not a one-off. It is not an experience of a moment. It is a lifetime commitment that says, this is work that I need to do to encounter others in this world in which we live. We are a diverse community. I can certainly speak to my experience. I could talk about my family, but we have diversities that we encounter every single day from that list that I talked about earlier. So how do we increase our competencies in these areas in ways that allow and shape us in a different way than we have been socialized? And I'll come back to this probably in our Q&A. I want to talk about also practices of anti-oppression. So if we're going to know ourselves, do the work, take on intercultural competencies with intention and practice that, then our work becomes layered in a practice of anti-oppression. there's a personal responsibility that happens in here as well. So practicing anti-oppression work in real terms is not only confronting individual examples of bigotry, which is some of what we're talking about, or confronting societal examples, it is also confronting ourselves and our own roles of power and oppression in our communities and the bigger picture. Though you may be a person that would never think to ever say anything racist, sexist, classist, etc., by not realizing the power that you hold and how your actions affect other people, you will inevitably fall into sustaining and contributing to a larger system of oppression. This is my final point here. So knowing ourselves, doing our work really leads us to this place, to being able to have anti-oppression practices that are entrenched in us in such a way that they inform our work. So if we get to that place where we are practicing an anti-oppression model for our living, then it says that we have increased our awareness, we have done the work, and our racial IQ is elevated in such a way that it reduces the oppression in the practices of our daily lives. So I want to close. The last thing I want to say here is we need to be able to value the experiences of others. We have heard over and over again stories of racial injustices, stories of oppression. The ones that I shared, there may be others that you have heard about. What do those stories mean to us, and how do we give those value enough to do the work that we need to do? When you hear someone else's story, how does that invite you into a level of awareness about yourself? What does it mean for you to be able to listen, to hear, to understand someone else's experience in a way that motivates you to think about perhaps what your response would be, how you would experience that moment, not in a way that second guesses someone else's experience, but invites us to say there is something different that could happen in this experience. As I watched the situation unfolding these past few weeks in Ukraine, it was heartbreaking to hear the stories that were emerging and to wonder at what it meant for those individuals to be in crisis and not be able to get what they needed. So, as we close out this moment, I invite any questions that you have and move us into a time of dialogue together.
Wow, what inspiring and insightful thoughts you've given to us, Reverend Dr. Thompson. As people are beginning to put their thoughts together to ask questions in the question box, I'll start with one. I'm wondering, could you maybe share with us some of the new growing edges or new challenges that you've seen over the course of your particular ministry? Where are we doing better? Where are we perhaps needing to address immediately?
Yeah, so let me talk about some of what we might be doing better. I think, first of all, that perhaps in this living through, I'm going to call them pandemics, right? So COVID-19, I think, has reshaped the way in which we see and understand the world. And I think also the 2020 naming of racism as a pandemic I think has also journeying along with COVID-19, I think has brought to the fore in many of our contexts conversations about racism and racial injustice that I think are causing us to be a little bit more introspective as communities, intentional as organizations, and I think has provided maybe a different kind of space for calling out what has always been present among us, but perhaps in many ways has been either taboo for discussion or has left people uncomfortable, whether it's people who have perpetuated those actions or people who have been recipient. I think that it's been challenging and it's been uncomfortable to talk about this, particularly because of the historic narratives. Whether we go back to the enslavement of Africans or we talk about the civil rights movement, that all of those places are fraught with pain and discomfort. And I think that the last 2 years in particular has globalized racial injustice in a way I think that has shifted that a little bit and has raised some additional questions, I think, that society has begun to grapple with, and also I think has elevated um, the what has historically been known in Black communities, that racism that to watch, particularly in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, watching communities around the world speak up and speak out with communities, African descendant communities, to talk about what has been a problem for a long time. And I would say that it's also similar in the emergence of these conversations around Indigenous peoples, Asian Americans, and others who have historically borne the brunt of violence and oppression because of our predominant narratives.
Yes, has certainly been, it feels like we are changing, that our culture in general is beginning to come to terms with some of the great challenges that have just been under the surface. So we have a question here from Ron Scott, who says, I have heard the term Sunday mornings can be the most segregated hour of the week. What are your thoughts about the church being diverse?
I'm going to start with the Sunday morning part first, because I think that there's certainly a history of segregation that has been present in the church. And that history of segregation goes back to the enslavement of people and this idea of enslaved people being in the balconies or outside of churches. So there's a history to this. There's the history of the AME churches, the Methodist Episcopal churches, and their emergence from the balconies, right, of historically white churches, the divisions that have existed in many denominations, right, and there are most of our denominations, if you exclude the historically Black churches, the majority of our denominations, especially mainline denominations, are mostly white. But we live in a country where the demographics are also stark, in that, this country is less than 20%, Black people. And then if you begin to talk about the other demographics, then some of that also reflects our populations, but I think also that while many of our predominantly white churches are willing to have small numbers of people of color in attendance, very few white people are willing to be the minority in a predominantly in a church that's not white, right? So that too is a part of it. Is our dominant, our majority culture has expectations of minoritized presence, but no sense of their own willingness to be identified as a minority in most of the communities in where we're present. So I think the church has a lot of work to do, and we could name the church as a diverse presence. I am a member of the United Church of Christ, and when we have our General Synod, which is every 2 years, and the whole church shows up in that representational way, we see this broad diversity that is the church, and it's represented in the people that show up. It's represented in our music and our hymnody and our interpretations. But then when we go back to our own little enclaves, right, we are in majority cultures, whether that's predominant in one way or the other. And so I would say we still have a lot of work to do in that regard. But I think I would go back to this place about how each of us experiences that. I function all the time in a predominantly white environment. So it's not unusual for me to go into a church and I'm the only Black person, and that's happened to me many times in my life. But I think that there's an element of discomfort that goes with that too. And I think for many of us, we would rather not deal with the discomfort. And so I think it's going to take each of us stretching ourselves a little bit rather than having expectations that others are going to come and integrate for us the communities in which we live.
Yes, very, very insightful. We have more questions. We have J. Stuart Ball, who says, I'm a Canadian involved through my church with the truth and reconciliation process with Indigenous peoples. I perceive your presentation as equally applicable to that situation. Do you agree? And do you have any additional advice or comments?
Sure. And I followed the truth and reconciliation process in Canada. And participated in some ways through our full communion agreement in the United Church of Christ with the United Church of Canada. And I would agree in that it's similar. And I think that a part of the history here is of privilege, right? And what it means to be dominant culture, and not having to make intentional shifts to self, or walk with that self-awareness that examines, critiques, and interrogates what it means to hold privilege. Indigenous people globally have lives have been interrupted in such a stark way, right? By colonialism, patriarchy, Christianity as a part of the colonial enterprise, that these places around recovery, right? Recovery of traditions, and finding and holding identity in predominantly white spaces become incredibly important. I also want to name the call, I think, that comes out of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, to really name for communities some of the places where interaction with Indigenous people need to have intention in restoring rights that have been taken for granted. Because this is not just a spiritual conversation, right? This is also about people's human rights, dignity, and respect, which are often violated when we start talking about racial injustice.
You know, I wish we had a panel right now to have this conversation across the different specialists in this area. I know I'm not the only one that has many questions and would love to hear more about that. There's a question here on the last point, and I think that was when you were talking about Sunday mornings being segregated. I think that was when that was asked. On the last point, how do we help people listen? How do we motivate people to know themselves? They often try to avoid feeling embarrassed or responsible for the racism. People don't want to feel at blame.
Yeah. So I would name that as a major point of discomfort, right? Uh, no one wants to be blamed for anything. But I think there's a difference between uh, experiencing blame and owning responsibility. I experience those as two different things because blame feels like something that's imposed by someone else, right? That's external. Whereas responsibility is something that we hold and take action on, right? Um, so, so I think if we're willing to experience and hold responsibility for actions that we've taken, and to hear um, our experiences in that context, I believe that could shift then the actions that we take, right? Um, when I could name any number of times that I've had an experience of racism. An experience of racism is perpetuated by someone else. I have never, ever in my life been in a room where someone was asked to give an example of a time when they perpetuated an action of a racist action. That is never asked. The question is always asked, can someone give an example of when they experienced racism? So we have not held accountabilities for action, right? So, and at the same time, we have theologies that say, well, if an action is perpetuated against you, well, you should offer forgiveness. But we also live, and I'm talking about Christianity specifically now. I realize that we're also multi-faith here. But in Christianity, we're also called to repentance, right? Repentance is that place where we ask for forgiveness for the wrongs that we have done. But the frameworks that we have historically used around racism and racial injustice has been to let to let white people off the hook, right? And we've started naming that as white fragility. But if we're going to do our own work, right, and know ourselves, then I should be able to say, you know, I was walking down the street and I saw somebody coming and I crossed the street because I felt afraid. Or I saw somebody in the subway, I didn't know who this person was, and I felt afraid. Then you can begin to ask the question, where is that fear coming from? Because if you don't know somebody, why would you be afraid of that person? You see, you know, so again, our ability to sit with the discomfort, interrogate the discomfort, know ourselves in the moment is really the place that allows us to move beyond that experience that would then be projected onto someone else in a different situation.
Wow. So many things to consider. We have more questions. As you think about your own experiences in America, especially in places of education, what are some of the most frequent kinds of hurtful words, actions you've suffered that tell you that that person is likely not particularly self-aware, even in these high-level education arenas?
Um, you know, microaggressions are so much a part of life, living in this body, that, you know, I don't even have to go that far. I'm gonna tell you a story. Um, So I travel a lot. This is an ongoing issue, and it may sound trite, but it's actually one of my more interesting stories. I travel a lot for work and because I love to travel. And quite often, because I use the same airline all the time, I tend to be upgraded to first class. I I could tell you numerous stories about standing on lines and having people come and stand in front of me. And I'll say, "Excuse me, I'm standing on the line." My son is now 34 years old. And my very first experience of this, he was an infant. He was about 6 months old. We were traveling from LaGuardia Airport to Raleigh Durham Airport in probably 1989 because he was born in 1988. We were on the line. I'm holding an infant in my arm, and out of nowhere, these two white men came and stood in front of me. And I said, "Excuse me, I'm on the line." And they said, "Yes, this is the first class line." And I said, "I know." And they said, "Oh, you're traveling first class?" And I said, "Yes." At which point they both looked at each other and went and stood behind me. That was 1988, maybe 1989. My most recent experience of that was actually in uh, in 2018, standing in the airport in Atlanta and having somebody walk and stand right in front of me. So there's a disregard for presence, right? There's something that says you don't belong here, or more importantly, I don't think that you belong here. I think I don't even have to go back to education. I could talk about the church. Um, I have a poem that I wrote that I had thought about reading, but we don't have enough time. But there's a few years ago, I had this experience of being in a church gathering, and I walked into the lobby of the hotel, and one of the people who was present as a part of this meeting saw me coming and said to me, "When I saw you coming pushing your suitcase, I thought you were the cleaning woman." I could go on, but why? The whole point is, like, check yourself before you open your mouth. You know what I mean? Like maybe every thought doesn't have to escape your mouth if you have a level of self-awareness that allows you to process those kinds of things in an immediate way, that says that you cause no injury or harm to someone else based on what you say or actions that you take.
I'm just imagining if we could see everyone's faces in a different platform, that their face would be the same as mine, right? And hearing those stories. So thank you for your vulnerability and sharing those stories. We have a long question.
Okay.
I feel like all the past anti-racism work is being undone. Yes, people are more aware, but the loudest white people seem to embrace and cheer the racial divides and support the racial oppression going on through state level legislation. It probably doesn't help that I live and pastor in a state that is taking oppressive legislation from other states and passing even more oppressive versions of those. I'm not sure. I think there's a syntax thing. They are a white female pastor of a white congregation in a rural area of mostly white, in a mostly white county. I'm thankful my congregation is open to learning about social injustices, but how can we reach beyond our walls when it seems like no one wants to hear anything even remotely uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge of our day, right? And I think it also feels very regressive. Um, I would say, that courage is the order of the day. And I say that because I think that we're all called to be courageous, both in our conversations and in our actions. Being willing to find those places where advocacy requires our voice. Putting paper to pen around editorials in our community. I think also being socially active, meaning, you have to show up. I think that this idea that we somehow get to stay inside and accommodate safety for ourselves is actually a false narrative. There's that whole story about, them coming for everybody, and then finally,
Yes.
they came for us and there was nobody to speak. That I believe that we are all invited to use our privilege, because everybody has privilege on some level or other, that we're invited to use our privilege to lend voice and to decrease oppression, right? So wherever it is that I think I might own privilege, to find my place in a discord. I self-identify as heterosexual, and it has been important for me to lend my voice in the LGBTQ conversations, advocating on behalf of and with, right? And I think that for white people in our communities, you have got to speak up, and you have got to call out your peers and your colleagues when you hear them bringing these narratives that are rendering other people as subhuman, the jokes that continue, the calling people out of their names. We have got to be willing to be courageous in our pulpits and educate our communities that, and undo years and narratives of oppression. So I would say it takes courage. It takes courage for me every time I have one of these experiences, to call somebody out. And as a matter of fact, to be honest, after a while, it's just exhausting. So, we all want to be comfortable, but I don't think we get to be that. Because I would say, in many ways, we have privilege, but there are also ways in which we own narratives of oppression, right? So white women understand oppression as women, right? And so there's that dynamic. If you have children, you understand some of the dynamics around ageism, right? Or if you have aging parents, you know what I mean? So there are multiple ways, I think, in which we all encounter various ways in which a minoritized component of our society becomes victims to the isms, right? Which allow us to relate to something as big and huge as racism and racial injustice, and to find our voice in the midst of it.
My goodness. We have so many good questions that are popping up now as this conversation continues. I'm going to jump to one that says, greetings from Jamaica, Dr. Thompson. Would you say that forgiveness is part of God's justice? That is from Sandra Crooks. And how will we be able to seriously bridge the racial divide?
Okay, so let me talk about forgiveness. Yes, I believe that forgiveness is a part of God's design, and so is repentance. And forgiveness without an act of repentance is problematic, because it allows the individual who has perpetuated to continue with the same behaviors. We often say, well, in order for us to find relief when we experience harm, we have to offer forgiveness. Yes, but there should be an expectation even before somebody is expected to forgive. There should be an expectation of repentance and ownership of the wrong that has been done. And Jesus also spoke about that. I think the second thing is And I believe that the church needs to start teaching appropriate theologies of forgiveness and repentance. So there's work to be done. The second piece, which is about how do we begin to bridge this racial divide, I think that's the question for the 21st century. And again, if we are not willing to hold accountabilities and to take the responsibilities around the situations that we see among us, then nothing is going to change. We have been hearing stories about racism, racial injustice. We have seen people shot in the streets. We have seen death. We have seen abuse. We have seen the militarization of communities. We have seen the oppression that exists in poor countries around the world, most of which are Black countries. So in the midst of this globalized narrative, I think is a call to dominant culture and cultures to begin to de-escalate some of what we have seen, to take ownership, right, and to move this out of spiritualized space and to begin to call this for what it is. Racism is an injustice. Racism is causing trauma. Racism is a historic narrative that has journeyed with us. And until white people are willing to release and relinquish power that is held and privilege, there won't be any difference, because people of color, indigenous people, Hispanic people, Asian people don't cause racism. Racism is the product of an action perpetuated from a dominant place into a minoritized space.
Goodness. Wow. We could go on and on. I would invite you, Dr. Thompson, if you want to look at the question, if you can pull out that question box and see anything else you want to pick up as we begin to close. We do try to close right at the top of the hour, but may have a few minutes afterwards. While you're pulling that up with the technology, I know that there's some that need to leave right at the top of the hour. So let me just say, on behalf of all of them, thank you so much for being here today, for your wonderful spirit. You know, we could have several hours, several days of conversation and barely scratch the surface on this particular issue. So I know you all, if you could have your cameras on, would be thanking Reverend Dr. Thompson for your wonderful presentation today. I'm going to give a quick reminder, and then we'll stay a couple of minutes after to address some of the other questions that might be here. But I want to invite you to see you next week for our final session, April 5th, at the same time as we welcome Miriam Gallo from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to talk to us about what emergency managers want faith leaders to know. Remember to go to the webinar hub at crisiscareministries.net for all things webinar, and watch your inboxes. So thank you all for joining us. We'll stay on just a few more minutes if Dr. Thompson has a little bit more time.